Today, it's great to chat with Daniel Kahneman, one of the most influential psychologists of all time. Kahneman is known for his work on the psychology of judgment and decision-making, as well as behavioral economics, for which he was awarded the 2002 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. He's author of the best-selling book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and co-author of the recent book, Noise, A Flaw in Judgment. In 2013, Kahneman received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama. Daniel, it's so great to chat with you today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited to chat with you. You are such a legend in the field, as you know, and there's so much we could talk about, and I know we're going to get into all the nerdy stuff, but I actually want to start with more of the humanity of you, because I think your personal story and sort of where you were born and what you lived through is utterly fascinating and just like a one-of-a-kind kind of experience. So you were born in Tel Aviv, but you spent most of your childhood in Paris when it was occupied by Nazi Germany in 1940. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
So you lived through this time where, you know, even your father was picked up in the first major round of French Jews, but he was released 6 weeks later due to the intervention of his employer. Do you recall, do you have that memory in your head of like visiting that concentration camp or visiting where he was imprisoned?
Yeah, I have a very vivid memory, actually. It's, it was like a fortress, and of course we couldn't come close to it. There was a wall, and there were policemen, and there were lots of people hanging on, in all the windows, and lots of women and children. It was still, the extermination hadn't started yet, so we were still there. And one thing I do remember is a policeman telling us they're hungry in there. They're eating peels. And that is an image I've kept. I've also kept the image of my father when he was released. By the way, the story of his release is an interesting one because his employer was a fascist. In fact, he was one of the most important collaborators with the Nazis in France. But he really loved my father. And he had enough clout with the Germans to get my father released, as if he were essential to the war efforts, to the German war effort, because my father was a specialist in paints. He was a chemist.
Amazing. And when he came back, he was, basically skin and bones, but he came back in a suit. Is that right? With dignity?
Yeah, I mean, that is another image that I have. He was a short man. He had a childhood disease, so he was less than 5'6", I think, 5'5". But he weighed 45 kilos, which 45 kilos would be about 100 pounds, actually exactly 100 pounds. And there was very little of him, but my mother and I had gone out and we planned to be there to greet him. But he had come before us and had taken a bath and had put on a suit and was waiting for us before eating, although he must have been very, very hungry. And that image, he is the one who opened the door. That's an image of him that I've kept, yes.
And there's another story that I heard that just touched me so much where, there was this curfew, I guess after 6 p.m., Jews couldn't leave the house, and you were staying late at a friend's house, and you were coming home after that, and you turned your shirt inside out so that the Jewish star wouldn't be visible so you wouldn't get in trouble, and a guard saw you. And what happened next?
Well, he was an SS soldier, actually. He was wearing a black uniform, and I was 7 at the time, but I knew that they were the worst of the worst, and we were walking about to meet. I actually went a few years back. I went and I checked my memory of what the street looked like, and I found the exact spot where this had happened. But we walked towards each other, and he beckoned me, and and he picked me up and he hugged me. And I was really frightened that he would see into my sweater and see that I was wearing a Star of David, but he didn't. He put me down. He opened his wallet. He showed me a picture of a little boy, and he gave me some money. And then he went his way, I went mine, and yeah, that's a story I remember quite vividly.
And your mom had told you that humans are endlessly complicated and fascinating, and that certainly dovetails with your mom's wisdom there.
Yeah, I mean that I really remember, because it is true that my mom was a gossip, but she was an interesting gossip, and nothing was black and white. And gossip wasn't about stories; it was about people's character, and it was always complicated. And I remember thinking that this is really complicated. I mean, here is this man, he would just as soon kill me, but he has a little boy just like me, and he has emotions just like my father. Yeah, I went
So
through
this,
that.
yeah, this is the start of seeing the complexity of human psychology there, in such a remarkable way. So when France was liberated, so you moved around, when your father came back,
Yeah,
kind of on the
we
run.
had to escape, so we escaped.
Yeah.
France was divided at the time between occupied France, which was literally occupied by the Germans, and sort of the other part of France, which was sort of governed by French fascists who collaborated with the Germans, but they were less bad to the Jews, of course. And so we escaped there in 1942 when I was 8. And that's where we spent the rest of the. And then the Germans rolled into that area when the Allies were threatening invasion. And then the situation became very, very, well, impossible for the Jews. And so we moved around. We ended the war in a chicken coop, actually, a converted chicken coop, next to a cafe in a small village in the middle of France, near Limoges, and that's where my father died, and that's where we were. He died 6 weeks before D-Day, before the Allies invaded Europe, and that's where we were when the war ended.
Amazing. It's just amazing. It's all, what is amazing as well is that young children go through these things, and without just thinking it's not, I mean, at some level it's not normal, but it can kind of, you don't know any other kind of life, right? I remember my grandma telling me, because she escaped the pogroms in Russia, and I remember her telling me how she hid in a wagon and went from, and it was just like, oh, this is what normal children do. They escape, they escape guards in a wagon, what was it, just thinking back to your memory of what you were thinking during that time. Do you remember thinking to yourself, like this is wrong, or did you think to yourself, oh, this is just normal?
No, I mean, I knew it wasn't normal.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the thoughts that I remember having, actually, was I had a sister who was 9 years older than I was. So I was 9, she was 18. And she could have joined the resistance, the French resistance. But it turned out later that I was the only member of the family to whom this thought occurred, because our mentality was the mentality of hunted rabbits. And hunted rabbits just don't fight back. I mean, they just try to survive another day. And that was very an important part, actually, of my identity. And that made living in Israel, moving to Israel, a very a major experience in my life, because Israel was a symbol of not being rabbits anymore. I mean, this is a place where you can defend yourself, where you can be strong. And during the war, the main thing that I was weakness and strength, and the idea that rabbits are weak. And I even thought that my father was weak for dying when we needed him. And so, I lived through that. But I should add, I don't think that this shaped me in any profound way. I don't know what I would have been with different experiences, but I really do not trace anything that happened to me to those years.
Fascinating. I guess we can't do the experiment, but it must have, at the very least, shaped your interest in human psychology.
Right? Yeah, it probably did.
Yeah. Yeah. So France was liberated, and in 1946, the family moved to Palestine. This is pre-Israel. This is at the birth. You're literally at the birth of a nation, right? What was it? It wasn't called Palestine. It was called the British Mandatory Palestine, right, or something like that. Yeah. My only question there is, what was that like? I mean, there's not many people I can ask. What was it like to live at the birth of Israel?
That's right. Not all that many. Well, I remember we moved there in 1946, and in 1947, there was a UN declaration that allowed a Jewish state to exist. And I remember dancing in the streets. I was 13 then. And the war began as soon as the British retreated. Israel was attacked by the Arab countries around it, and there was a war, and it lasted off and on for more than a year. The casualty level was huge by the standards of today. There were 1% of the population of the population at the beginning died in the war. But by the end of the war in 1949, it was a new country, and and it was still very new when I went into the army. I don't know if you want to go into that.
Yeah, go into it.
Well, so everything was really new, and everything had to be improvised, from uniforms to rules, regulations, what have you. I was 17 when I graduated from high school, and there was a special unit of the Israeli army that was called the Academic Reserve, and where it was the equivalent of our OTC, but where you went through officer training during the summers, but went to university. And I studied psychology and mathematics. And in 1954, I went into the army. So that's a very long time ago. And I was a platoon commander for a year. And then I became a psychologist because, I had a BA in psychology. And as with a BA in psychology, I was the best trained psychologist in the Israeli army. I mean, there was my direct commander. I was in a research unit, and my direct commander was a chemist. His training had been in chemistry, absolutely a brilliant man. And we were doing things that, I was assigned to do things that I had no business doing, like setting up an interviewing system for the Israeli army, which I did. And only recently, I got a copy of the report that I wrote in 1956. It's signed by Lieutenant Kahneman with my number. Very short number, because this was really the beginning. I mean, the numbers now, the soldiers' numbers are much, much longer. But and I described, how I had set up the interview, and it turned out that interview and everything around it had a profound influence on my career and on my thinking. And it's actually, I'm really ending my career by repeating the main principles that guided me when I created that interview in 1956. So this is surely an unusual and very fortunate experience, because the idea of the interview, I had read a book by Paul Mead. I mean, my boss, the chemist, had given me that book to read. It had just come out. And I was very influenced by it, and by the idea that you really couldn't trust people's judgments, and that you wanted things to be as objective as possible. And so I constructed, instead of the clinical interview where your objective is to form a mental image of your patient, of your patient or the recruit, whoever it is, the system that existed in the Israeli army when I came in was a clinical interview where people had to interview recruits and decided how fit they were for combat. And there was enough information to know that interview had no validity or whatsoever, or almost none. And so I was assigned to improve on it. And from Neil, I learned that reliability is essential. And so instead of having people form an intuitive opinion, I had them rate 6 traits. That is, the interview was divided into 6 parts, each associated with a particular trait that they had to rate on a scale from 1 to 5 at the end of each part of the interview. And they were strongly discouraged from trying to form a general image until all the information was in. And so that was the interview. And there were interviewers. I was like 22 at the time, and they were 20. But I was in charge, and they were furious with me.
What?
And they were furious with me because they had been doing those clinical interviews, and they had been using their intuitions, and they had been feeling very good about their intuitions. And I remember one of them saying, "You're turning us into robots." That is because there were questions. It was a semi-structured interview. There was a list of questions about each of several traits, like how punctual you were, how sociable you were. I had one that was called masculine pride, which today you wouldn't want to use that term, but at the time it seemed very fitting. And so I told them, I realized that the morale was at stake, that it was really unacceptable to them not to have an outlet for their intuition. And so I told them, you do the interview my way. And don't worry about validity. You worry about reliability. I mean, in my arrogance, I said, I will worry about the validity. You worry about being reliable. But when you're done, close your eyes and make a judgment of how good a soldier will that soldier be. And there are 2 stories associated with that. The first one is that a few months later, we got data on the validity of the interview for various criteria, like being sent to officer training or going to jail or different things that could happen to a soldier. And it turned out that the interview had really significant validity. I mean, it was a big improvement on what had happened before. But what was quite remarkable in the results was that intuitive judgment at the very end was very good. In fact, it was just as good as the average of the 6 ratings, which I thought we would use, and it added information. That is, so the final score was the average of the 6 ratings and the final rating, because that's what came out, that it was independently valid. And that stayed with me all my life. That is, that you should watch it. You shouldn't trust intuition, but ultimately you have to have it. And ultimately it's a wonderful thing, but you have to delay it. And it turns out that in the book that I'm working on, I was working on until a couple of months ago, which is coming out in May. We have a recommendation for how to make judgments and decisions. And it's break the problem, rate each aspect of the problem independently, delay intuition, then look at the profile of your ratings and follow your judgment. So that stayed with me evidently for over 60 years.
That's incredible. So the start of your psychology career in a way showed you that there is the intuition can be spot on.
Yeah.
You know, that's really that's really cool. And we're gonna get to that later, the intelligence of intuition for sure. So just to kind of wrap up this early part of your life, after you got your then you went and got a PhD right from Berkeley.
Yeah.
And your dissertation was advised by Susan Irvin.
Yes.
It examined relations between adjectives and the semantic differential. And also you got a chance to do Fortran programming. I think you enjoyed it. I remember Pascal, I think, was programming in my childhood, but even before Pascal was Fortran, right? So that was even before
Fortran was the very first language that was accessible to non-programmers. It was a compiled language, but it was very, very basic. And I was actually, I think, in the first or second course that was ever given to sort of civilians on the use of Fortran. It was given at MIT in 1960. It lasted a week, and that's where I learned Fortran 1, which was really, that's when it began.
That's the beginning. That's the beginning. Yeah.
My thesis program, so I spent most of the effort was programming. It would take 20 minutes on the Berkeley mainframe. And I could watch the Berkeley mainframe. You could watch it, from a window. And there were 9 large tape units. And my program used them all. And I could tell whether the program was working by whether the tapes were working in the proper sequence. Just think of what it was then. That was the Berkeley mainframe, the main computer of the University of California in Berkeley. And think of your iPhone today. So that's what's happened in my lifetime.
Well, we definitely have come a long way. It'll be interesting to see where it is like 60 years from now, if it's going to be the same exponential rate. So your early work focused on visual perception and attention. Your first post was at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1961. How did you make a shift from visual perception and attention, which are, staples of the cognitive science field? I was trained in that. Everyone in cognitive science PhD, you start with that, I feel like. And then how did you move into judgment decision making? I believe that was when you met Tversky, right?
Yeah, Amos Tversky was a young colleague of mine at Hebrew University. He was 3 years younger, and he was known to everybody as the most brilliant person around. And I invited him as a guest in a seminar that I was teaching, and he gave a talk in that seminar on work, not that he had done himself, on work that was being done at Michigan at the time, on a study that was called the study of intuitive statisticians. And the conclusion of that study was people are pretty good intuitive statisticians. So that's the work that he described. And I had been teaching statistics, and I had experiences about how miserable people are, including myself, as intuitive statisticians. So I knew this was wrong. And Israelis have a style of debating that is world famous. It's quite merciless. And so I engaged almost in that debate in front of the class. And it turned out to be a very good conversation. I think I won that debate because that's what started our joint work, which was basically questioning intuitive statistics. So and then we became very close friends, and
the rest is history, so to speak.
Yeah, in a way. It turned out that this was a very important friendship. It dominated our lives for 10, 12 years, we spent hours every day together, nuts. And there was really no separation between work and fun because work was so much fun. And the study of, because of the topic that we had chosen, the topic that we had chosen was incorrect intuitions. And our subjects, we were our own subjects. So we were looking for cases in which our own intuitions were flawed. And that is a sort of ironic and sort of very funny. And Amos had a really extraordinary sense of humor. He loved laughing, and he made me laugh. And he improved my sense of humor. So I made him laugh. And we laughed a lot. And that was very happy period.
It's beautiful. So let me just get this straight. So when you were in this meeting and you challenged him a little bit about the positive aspects of intuition, were you drawing on your intuition to say that intuition isn't as positive as he's made it out to be, or were you basing it on some other research?
The conclusion of that Michigan research was that people are essentially Bayesian, which means that they make correct inferences from data, except that they are conservative Bayesian. That is, they do not they do not draw enough from information. And I said, this is absurd. In fact, and I cited something that I attributed to Daniel Kahneman, who was then a very famous comedian. Very little of him remains, but he had described a person as a woman, and that's what I remember. It turned out later that I misremembered some of it, but as he said that her favorite position is besides herself, and her favorite sport is jumping to conclusions. and this idea that people jump to conclusions is, when it's obvious that it takes very little for us to form a complete image. And that was so clearly incompatible with the idea of people being conservative Bayesian that it made that idea seem silly, I think. Anyway, I still think so. Not everybody agrees, of course.
Well,
but that's what set us up.
I love it. You talk about the importance of adversarial, you call it adversarial collaboration. Now, what a perfect example of a situation where you form such a warm friendship with someone.
This was not,
it wasn't that adversarial. It wasn't adversarial. Yeah, that's fair enough. That's fair enough.
It was friendly from the beginning.
Well, maybe Gary Klein fits more into that situation. So we can talk about Gary Klein in a second. So this is research that Gary Klein had been spending his career basically studying expertise, intuition, and firefighters and other fields, and just how right they can be when they do rely on their intuition. And I think you two thought there were more areas of disagreement than there really were when you finally got your heads together to write a paper about it. Is that right?
Well, it's a fairly complicated story. I had, as I told you, I had always believed that there are marvels to intuition. So I had never believed that there is nothing to it. And in fact, I remember that I had reviewed an early grant application by Gary, which I had reviewed favorably when I was still in Jerusalem a very long time ago. And so I invited Gary. I said, look, you and I have what seem to be completely contradictory beliefs. You believe in experts, you believe in intuition. I question experts, I question intuition. We must both be right. Let's find out where we're right. So let's find out the boundary. Where is intuition good and where does it fail? And he agreed. And it's not that it was easy. That took us 6 years. But at the end of 6 years, we had the paper that was, I think, pretty good, and we had a friendship. So that was the most successful adversarial collaboration of my life.
Oh, beautiful. Well, can you remind me the title of the paper? Because I really liked the title. I remember when I saw it.
The paper was A Failure to Disagree.
A Failure to Disagree. I love that.
Thank you. It's that expert intuition, a failure to disagree. I think that's the title. But a failure to disagree is certainly in the title.
I'd like to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, BetterHelp. Is there something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? For quite a lot of us right now during this coronavirus pandemic, we are struggling with our most fundamental basic needs, such as our needs for security, connection, and opportunities to master our work. I think all of us could use some therapy right now. I know I sure could, which is why I've really been enjoying working with a professional therapist at BetterHelp so I can realize the best version of myself even under the current circumstances. BetterHelp will assess your needs and match you with your own licensed professional therapist, and you can start communicating with your therapist in just under 48 hours. Note that it's not a crisis line and it's not self-help. It is professional counseling done securely online. There is a broad range of expertise available, which may not be locally available in many areas. In fact, the service is available for clients worldwide. What I really like about BetterHelp is that you can log into your account anytime and send a message to your counselor. You'll get timely and thoughtful responses, plus you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions so you won't ever have to sit in an uncomfortable waiting room as you often have to do with traditional therapy. BetterHelp is really committed to facilitating great therapeutic matches, so they make it easy and free to change counselors if needed. It's more affordable than traditional offline counseling, and financial aid is available. BetterHelp wants you to start living a happier life today. Visit their website and read their testimonials that are posted daily. Here's a recent one. Camilla helped me turn my life around. Everything has been so positive for me since our first session. Deep gratitude. I'm pleased to announce a special offer for listeners of the Psychology Podcast. You can get 10% off your first month of professional counseling by going to betterhelp.com/psychpodcast. That's betterhelp.com/psychpodcast. Join the over 1 million people who have taken charge of their mental health with the help of an experienced professional. I've been on the search for the perfect mattress for the past few years, and let me tell you, I've gone through so many mattresses. My friends have made fun of me because for so long I didn't actually own a mattress. I just went through so many free trials. I had no idea what it feels like to be well rested until I tried a Helix mattress. Are you not able to sleep because of stress and anxiety? It's definitely understandable given the current state of the world. Psychological research shows that high quality sleep is so important for stress and well-being though. Lack of quality sleep can affect your memory, increase mood swings, and even can lead to depression. While a number of factors contribute to poor sleep quality, your choice of mattress can really matter a lot. Helix Sleep makes personalized mattresses right here in America and ships them straight to your door with free, no-contact delivery, free returns, and a 100-night sleep trial. To choose a mattress, Helix made a quiz that takes just 2 minutes to complete and matches your body type and sleep preferences to the perfect mattress for you. If you like a mattress that's really soft or firm, you sleep on your side or your back or your stomach, or you sleep really hot, with Helix, there's a specific mattress for each and everyone's unique taste. Personally, I took the quiz and I was matched with the Helix Sunset Luxe because I wanted something that felt soft, and I sleep mostly on my side all night. I've got to say, I love my Helix mattress. I wake up with zero back and neck pain, which happened to me a lot before. I wake up really feeling refreshed and ready to work out or start my work. Also, I've been tracking my sleep with a device, and my sleep score is consistently in the good or excellent range. This is a new thing for me, so it's really exciting to finally get high quality sleep. I really do love Helix, but you don't have to take my word for it. Helix was awarded the #1 best overall mattress pick of 2020 by GQ, Wired Magazine, and Apartment Therapy. Just go to helixsleep.com/psychology, take their 2-minute sleep quiz, and they'll match you to a customized mattress that will give you the best sleep of your life. They have a 10-year warranty, and you get to try it out for 100 nights risk-free. They'll even pick it up for you if you don't love it, but you probably will. Right now, Helix is offering up to $200 off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows for our listeners at helixsleep.com/psychology. Get up to $200 off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows at helixsleep.com/psychology. That's helixsleep.com/psychology. Okay, now back to the show. You know, you had written at one point, you said, I had limited ambitions. I didn't aspire to great success. I was very hardworking, but I didn't expect to be a famous psychologist. So it's not like you had these dreams when you're young, like I'm going to be a famous psychologist. You sort of, in a sense, fell into these topics, and then they captivated your interest, and you did great work with them. I mean, how would you describe the situation?
Well,
how are you so great?
Well, I started out actually feeling that my training had been inferior because I had, I'd been let loose in Berkeley. I really didn't study systematically. I just read and I studied and picked up a lot of things. And I remember that when I came to Hebrew University, I decided that I would like eventually to become a chef, I remember saying. But I first of all have to learn to be a short order cook. And so I started a really very limited and very precise experimental project on vision, which I continued for several years. And I felt I was in training, that I was training myself to become an experimental psychologist. And when I met Amos, I was starting to become slightly more ambitious, but I certainly had no expectations of any major success. Now, he was already a star. So he was a star from graduate school and immediately recognized as such. I was good, but he was a star. And then together we were, I think, better than he was. I mean, we were far better than either of us. And so I was very lucky.
So was he. It sounds like just a really special collaboration, a once in a lifetime kind of collaboration that people will be very lucky to find in their careers.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I have a few people like that in my life. I want to give a shout out to Colin DeYoung and David Yaden and James Kaufman and other researchers. When you get these special people, in your academic collaborations, you want to hold on to them. Let's talk about System 1 versus System 2. Could you explain to our listeners a little bit about, just how you would define the difference between the two before we really nerd out about this?
Well, there is a long history in psychology of the distinction between automatic processing and control processing. And it started out with studies of search and how you start searching, say, for a letter, for a particular target letter in a set of letters. And you do that hundreds and hundreds of times. You look for that letter. And eventually, that letter pops out at you. Search changes character. Something becomes automatic. And this is something that happens in skill learning. We learn to drive, and then you can drive without thinking. You learn to speak a foreign language, and then you speak it without having to translate from your original language. So we had that experience of those two modes, and that's been studied fairly extensively. And there were many people drawing on that distinction. And the terms System 1 and System 2 were invented by one of these people, Keith Stanovich, who was also interested in the field of judgment and decision-making. So he was doing research using problems that Amos Tversky and I had developed. So I was familiar with his work. And I really loved that distinction between the two, because it seemed to resolve a controversy in which we had been involved. So we did a lot of work on failures of intuitive thinking, which were sort of failures of thinking. So but other people found that you could create variations on those problems or create different contexts in which people could solve those problems. So there seemed to be and they questioned our conclusions. But it turned out that the distinction between System 1 and System 2 is very useful in this context, because what these people had done, who found that our errors, they could make, as it were, cognitive illusions disappear. It's a well-known German psychologist, Gerd Gigerenzer, was sort of intellectual adversary on this. And that's this phrase. It's a title of one of his papers, Making Cognitive Illusions Disappear. But you can make cognitive illusions disappear by providing cues that mobilize controlled thinking, so that you're not blurting out your intuitions, but you actually compute or you reason your way to an answer. And then cognitive illusions do disappear. They can disappear. And so that's what motivated me to adopt that distinction as an essential distinction, with that it seemed to resolve the controversy, so far as I was concerned, between Gerd Gigerenzer and ourselves. And then there was a lot that you could do with that distinction. And eventually that became the core of what I wrote 10 years later.
This is great. So let's just shift into like colleague mode of nerding out at a really deep level about this stuff. Because my dissertation, I was so ensconced in all this work. I loved the System 1, System 2 distinction as well. I read Robots Rebellion by Keith Stanovich, and it blew my mind. And I realized that the field of intelligence research had completely ignored this distinction. It never even like dawned on intelligence researchers in 100 years to think that maybe we should call some of these System 1 processes intelligence. So so I won't even know where I'm coming from. I was just totally ensconced in this work, and then started to do some research on to see if there are individual differences in an intuitive, unconscious system of intelligence of System 1. And then when I was digging into this research, I started to get into all the debates. So some people argue that the word system is not correct. Some people say, well, we should call it types. So some research said it's really type 1 processes versus type 2 processes, because it's a lot of different types of processes under an overall umbrella, right? You have within System 1, you can have things as varied from language learning to social cue learning to aesthetic intuition to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, there's a whole wide range of things that we're labeling them all under, or the same, just like it's all this System 1. And then with System 2, you have a whole potpourri of different forms of rationality. Keith Stanovich, as he's gone through quite sensibly, and all through different types of different ways that we can use the rationality, use our System 2 thinking to override the intelligence. Yes. So my question is, have you stayed up on these really nerdy debates, and where do you see merit in kind of? Yeah,
I think it's a very important debate, and clearly there is a tradition in psychology that you're not supposed to invoke homunculi being little people in the head whose behavior explains a person's behavior. And System 1 and System 2 are homuncular. So there's no question. I very deliberately, in the book that I wrote, Thinking Fast and Slow, I tried to get people to appreciate the personalities of System 1 and System 2. Now, why did I do that? And I explained that in the first pages, that actually Type 1 and Type 2 is the proper terminology, because there are broad types of mental activities. But when you think of System 1 and System 2, you think of them as agents. And the mind is specialized for thinking about agents and not about categories. So agents have personalities, agents have tendencies, agents take action, agents have goals, and we're ready for that. So it makes it easier to think about psychology when you think of those agents. So Type 1 and Type 2, they call for lists, and people are miserable with lists. What people are very good at, is finding routes in space, path to go from one place to the other. We're specialized for that. And we're specialized for thinking about agents. Lists are terrible. And so that's why I went to that language quite deliberately. I said, those are fictions. There are no systems in the brain. It's just a way of talking, but it's a very useful way of talking. But the people who have criticized me on this I think they may have had a point, because a couple of days ago I was talking to undergraduates at Cornell who had questions about my book, and they were speaking about System 1 and System 2 as if they were agents in the head.
Hmm.
They were not thinking that this is an easy way of thinking about type 1 and type 2, which is what I intended. But, they were asking him, what do System 1 and System 2 do in an infant, in a dog, or, none of that was what I had really intended. So to some extent, there is a risk of corrupting psychological thinking by bringing those homunculi. The risk is real. The benefits are also real.
I agree both the risk and the benefits. But you see people in the general public talking about this, and I notice that some people start to try to just as a shorthand map it on to brain systems. Some people actually map it on to like left brain versus right brain thinking, and it makes my brain want to explode when I see that. No, it's not like that's the problem with talking about it as two discrete categories, because then people think, oh, so all the system 1 stuff is here, all the system 2 stuff is, when there's such a very different process. So yeah, I think it's just important, as you do, and I want to give you credit for mentioning this in your book, to kind of to not try to essentialize it and not view them as agents, but people will do it anyway in the general public who don't know all the nuanced nerdy literature.
But I think, for professionals, you use that language and it helps you think, but you always remember that you can translate anything that you say about System 1 or System 2, you can translate into a more cumbersome but more accurate formulation of type 1 and type 2. It's just easier to think about.
Yeah, for sure. But the general idea in the Robots Rebellion, the work Keith Steinovich did, just opened up a portal into my whole thinking about fundamental issues of consciousness, of free will. I started to really think in grad school. I started to think, does System 2 have more free will than System 1? Even just that question, I wanted people to talk to me about it. What's some of your thinking on free will? I mean, I think we're probably both agreed that there's no magic free will. There's no, we believe that, in determinism to a certain degree, but that there might still be a free will worth wanting. And if there is there any hope for it in System 2, or is there any hope for it in System 1?
You have found, I think, the wrong person to talk with.
Fair enough.
Because I had the same response to questions about free will and about consciousness. I mean, I know that people find them very exciting, and somehow I don't. And I don't because I don't know what it would look like. I don't know what a solution would look like. And to raise a problem when you have no idea of what you would consider to be a solution somehow that is something that I'm not attracted to. I understand that, brilliant people, many people I respect are fascinated by these questions, but somehow they don't speak to me. And I can see, obviously, people feel their free will. Obviously, brain is a physical object and with rules of its own, and there seems to be a tension between this feeling. And altogether, it's a mystery, how does feeling work in a world of objects? How does consciousness interact with objects? But obviously, it's a puzzle, but it's a puzzle that I think we have no way of even approaching and knowing what it would be like to solve. And for some reason, I have that block that if I can't imagine a solution, I don't want to go into the problem.
I really appreciate that. And we certainly don't need to even go there to say things like some System 2 processes such as cognitive control and reasoning and problem solving give us more freedom or more degrees of freedom.
They feel voluntary. I mean, right. The basic distinction that I draw between System 1 operations and System 2 operations. System 1 operations are things you do, and System 2 operations are things you do, and System 1 operations happen to you. So, that distinction, if you is, if you want to talk in terms of will, of free will or control, but obviously system 2 is control and system 1 is not.
Right. As soon as it's uncontroversial to use words like control and freedom. As soon as you start saying free will, then the philosophers and the people who care about that get all mad because now you've entered their realm of linguistics. We're calling free will is determinate. Magical free will from going back to the Big Bang, and it's like, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. So fair enough. Well, here's a topic I think does interest you because you reached out to me about eight years ago or so. I was so deeply touched. I want you to know that. I almost fell off my chair. Actually, I was sitting on my bed when I read your email, and it said at the end, I got to the bottom, said Daniel Kahneman. I almost fell off my bed. I can't believe I got an email out of the blue from Daniel Kahneman. But it was in relation to my dissertation work on the fact that there may be individual differences in System 1. And I'd love to talk to you about individual differences because I know it's not a topic that you've devoted your career to, but I believe you said to me that if you could do a second career, you might actually start to do some individual differences work. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm actually working on individual differences these days. So
amazing. Let's talk about it.
Late in life, I've turned to that.
Wonderful.
I belong to a team that is trying to understand the famous cognitive reflection test. And the bat and ball problem must be familiar to all your listeners, and trying to understand the bat and ball problem. And Shane Frederick, who is the sort of the fount of that whole line of research, he did that actually when he was a postdoc with me. And we were writing a paper together, which was the first effort to distinguish System 1 and System 2. That's where we introduced the notions of System 1 and System 2. And it's a key example of System 1 and System 2 because I say a bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And you have an association. And the association is 10 cents. And you solve that problem as if you were said $1.10 is $1 more than 10 cents. I mean, that seems to happen. Now, it turns out there are very interesting individual differences. And some people fail that problem because they fail problems. So that's a lack of aptitude of one kind or another. But there is an interesting class of people who fail that problem, although they could easily solve it. So 50% of Harvard students say 10 cents. Now, clearly, if they bothered to check, they would know that they made a mistake. And almost all of them, if they spent a minute or two, would solve that problem. The answer is 5 cents. So what do we learn? We learn they don't check. That is, we learn that their System 2 accepts the immediate association of System 1. And so there is that class of people who could solve the problem but don't. And they're a very interesting group of people. So they also tend to believe in conspiracy theories. They tend to believe in bullshit of all kinds. They're different from other intelligent people in multiple ways.
Something that I think that's worth bringing up here is Seymour Epstein's distinction between the experiential mind and the rational mind. I had the great pleasure of having Seymour Epstein on my podcast a couple of years ago, and he felt quite frankly, he felt as though his dual process theory had not gotten as much attention as he wished it could have. So out of honor to him, who he's no longer with us, I wanted to bring this up because I think there was a lot of merit in his work at linking the experiential mind to superstition and to conspiracy theories and all sorts of things. So yeah, I want to hear some of your thoughts on this.
He had every reason to be upset with people, including and certainly with me, because I don't think I mentioned his work in Thinking Fast and Slow, and I certainly should have done, because it was relevant, it was creative, but I actually did not know enough, and I didn't think of including it. So he was absolutely right. He in fact, I think had been there with that distinction, which is one of those dichotomies that people were working on in the 80s and 90s. It had been there early, I think, before the System 1, System 2 distinction was formulated.
That's right.
And he had some brilliant examples of it. He had some beautiful examples of that were similar to the kinds of thing that Amos Tversky and I had done, that he attributed to the experiential mode of thinking. So yes, that is a regret I have, which is not doing more with his work in my book, because he happened to be upset.
That's incredibly gracious of you to say that. I formed like a friendship with him in the last couple of years of his life, and he actually asked me if I'd write the foreword to his book on summarizing his life's work. So I hope that I honored it. He seemed to be happy with the foreword. So it made me happy to see him feel as though, even
because I think I heard that he felt aggrieved and I'm sorry about my part in this.
Well, that's incredibly gracious of you. It's obviously not just, it's not you. It's a whole, system. A system. I keep using the word system, but there's so many proliferation of different dual process theories. Someone wrote a review of like 40 to 50 different dual process theories. You can't. To be fair to you for a second, it's not like you can write about every single one and all the different nuance when you're writing a popular book. So yeah.
No. So I just adopted that terminology. In fact, I described my interpretation of what those systems are. I didn't try to do justice to the intellectual history of it. But he really had made contributions that if I had thought more carefully, I could have included, and I didn't.
Beautiful. I'm touched by even your response to that. So yeah, it's just like the individual differences aspect. So this is the insight I had, and I want you to tell me what you think of this in my dissertation. There just was so much of a focus on individual differences in System 2. I mean, Keith Stanovich, it's all individual System 2, and Keith Stanovich had a line in one of his papers where he said, individual differences in System 1 are minimal or just not even worth considering. So I was like, oh, hell no. I'm working my dissertation, and this is what I wanted to directly challenge in my dissertation. I feel like this area of individual differences in System 1 has really been long neglected in the field of cognitive science. I found that there implicit learning, for instance, your ability to probabilistically learn the rule structure of the very complex rule structure of the world, was correlated almost zero with IQ. So you have people who have conscious ability to detect patterns who aren't terribly necessarily good. It's zero correlation, so it can go either way. With their ability to unconsciously detect complex patterns, and I thought that was interesting. What do you think?
Well, I think it is very interesting. The question that I was impressed by, and I was thinking of System 1 slightly differently than you did in my concern with individual differences when I approached you. And this was, for me, System 1 is where we have representations of the world, so that our model of the world is in associative memory. And that, for me, is the essence of System 1. And clearly, some people have very different models of the world. Some of them are more accurate than others, some are richer, some are poorer. And there are all those individual differences in the representation of the world that people form and maintain and use to simulate the world or to make predictions about what will happen, to generate explanations of what could happen. So there must be individual differences in that. And I didn't find any adequate treatment of that aspect, of the richness aspect. You're absolutely right that detecting patterns, which is what you were focused on, would be part of that general problem. And I was interested in forming patterns.
Makes a lot of sense. I think part of the bias in the field is the field has a bias towards scientific reasoning as the pinnacle of human achievement. And what bothered me is that arts achievement was really neglected. And so what I wanted to do was open up this whole world to individual differences in the experiential mind being linked to artistic and aesthetics. And it did. So when I found these individual differences, I found they were linked to openness to experience, the personality trait, which then opened up the whole world of creativity and the arts and all these things that that I feel like the judgment and reasoning literature is they're not terribly excited about. They're not excited about this arts, the arts, Do you know what I mean?
No, I think that's very interesting, and you're absolutely right. It's very largely neglected, and that whole tradition of work on thinking and reasoning and judgment and decision making, it really, although it doesn't believe in logic as an explanation of psychology, but it's infused with it's a reaction to logic. Logic is always there. And the kind of thing that you're talking about, logic isn't even there.
And that's okay. And that's okay.
Yeah, and that's
it's
fine.
almost, there was such a bias. I felt like there was this meta bias in the bias literature towards emotions are always, that's bad. We got to control the emotions.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely.
But thank you for having that conversation with me, because I've been wanting to kind of really nerd out with you at that level of specificity. I'd like to take a moment to talk about a really cool podcast, the Addy Hour podcast. As we all know, this past year has been really difficult, from lockdowns to social isolation to racial injustice to political turmoil to lost lives and lost jobs. We're all craving a major dose of life satisfaction, connection, and emotional health. The Addy Hour podcast explores the topics and questions you've been thinking about and creates a unique space to talk about them. Dr. Nee Addy, Yale professor and researcher, man of faith, sports and hip-hop fan, and mental health advocate, and his guests explore a holistic approach to mental health today. Too often one-dimensional or dismissive approaches to mental health and emotional wellness prevent people from getting the help they need. The Addy Hour podcast focuses on the intersection of brain science, mental health, faith, culture, and social justice through dynamic conversations with community leaders, scientists and researchers, professional athletes and entertainers, faith leaders, mental health experts, and advocates. You can listen to the Addy Hour podcast today on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Okay, now back to the show. So let's move into hedonism or hedonic psychology. Let's move into hedonic psychology. So that is the work you started doing in the 90s when you kind of moving from judgment decision making to this. How did you move into that area? Did Ed Diener influence you at all?
No.
No. Okay.
No. I moved into that area because of a puzzle. And the puzzle that came up when Emerson and I were working on a theory of decision-making that we published as prospect theory, which deals with the curvature of utility functions or value functions, that we don't respond linearly to amounts of money, but that our response changes. That is, a difference of $100 makes a very big difference. If you have $100, it turns to 200. But if you have 10,000 and it's 10,100, the difference is psychologically much smaller. So there is that basic psychophysical fact. But I posed the following puzzle. I said, suppose you are supposed to get injections, painful injections in the butt, one a day. And you don't habituate to that. They're painful to the same degree. Now, how much would you pay to reduce the number of injections from 12 to 2 and from 20 to 10? Would you pay the same amount? And the intuition is you wouldn't pay the same amount. The intuition is you would pay more to reduce from 12 to 2 than from 20 to 10, because psychologically it's a bigger difference. But that's ridiculous, because the amount of pain that you're adding by construction is the same. So in both cases, you're saving yourself 10 days of pain, exactly the same amount. So it turns out that the logic of thinking, when you think about experiences, doesn't fit the logic of when you think about making decisions and about numbers. So that was the puzzle that led me into studying experience. So, and
Cool.
that's another way of looking at the basic concept of utility in economics and in sort of decision theory. Utility is inferred from choices, from preferences. But thinking of utility as an experience, that was non-existent in the field. I mean, Bentham had those ideas centuries ago, but in the field of decision making, that idea was absent, and absent in economics. So that's how I got to it.
Well, that is really cool, and it just feels like there were a whole bunch of confluence of things of that was like in the air, because Ed Diener soon after started studying life satisfaction as
Even before,
or even before, was it? Okay.
Ed Diener had been in the field of well-being a long time.
The 80s, even the 80s.
His entire career. He's younger than I am, but not by a whole lot. But yeah, in the early 80s, he had a classic review, so maybe 1982.
Gotcha.
But I moved into experiences of episodes, like, an episode of a medical procedure, an episode of watching a pleasant or unpleasant film that lasts a few minutes. How do you evaluate experiences? And from there, I got to the study of well-being. So that was the route that I found.
Well, it was an important bridge, and it was an important distinction that it's what allowed us to see this clear distinction between the experiential self and the remembered self. Ed Diener's work seems to be the remembered self. You're taking a self-report questionnaire, and it's saying, overall, how happy are you with your life? And you're trying to reflect back on it. In a lot of ways, you were kind of bringing some of the, even like the Mihai Csikszentmihalyi approach, you developed another one. He did experience sampling, but I believe you developed another technique that was really cool.
Ed Diener, by the way, had that distinction. He described well-being as being satisfied with your life, having positive affect, a lot of positive affect, and very little negative affect. So that was his concept. I came to that distinction between the two completely independently, really. But Ed had it. Ed, like the entire field, was focused on life satisfaction. That is, the idea of measuring well-being by measuring experience, that was really largely absent. Now, Csikszentmihalyi had done experience sampling, so he had studied that, but it was not perceived as a measure of well-being. It was not, and that's where the work that we did came in.
This is great. Thank you for helping talk me through so I get all the timelines right. I wanted to get it right. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, then Martin Seligman, he comes into the picture. Okay, so 1998, he starts this field, positive psychology. So you've had some criticisms of the field of positive psychology. I'd love to hear what some of your current thinking is, because I do think the field has evolved. I think the field did start out mostly focused on happiness and subjective well-being, but has now expanded. You have researchers studying meaning, the science of meaning, the connections, various multidimensional aspects of the overall well-being construct. So I'm wondering where you are today in your own thinking about the field.
So I was interested in the fact that there are those two definitions of happiness. I mean, one of them is life satisfaction, and the other is the average level of affect in your experience. And actually, you can measure them independently without going into detail. And they depend on different things. So the quality of experience, the average quality of your experience, really depends primarily on social context and on love and on how much time you spend with people you love. And those are the things that determine emotional happiness. Life satisfaction is determined much more conventionally by success, by how much you achieve relative to. And that's income and education and prestige, and they contribute. And sort of living a conventionally successful life. That is, to be married, to have children, not to be divorced, not to be involved in litigation, stuff like that. That's life satisfaction. So I was interested in that distinction, which is not the same distinction as between meaning and well-being. So
That's right.
I never did much with the meaning of life. In a way, it's related to the issue of consciousness that we were talking about. It didn't speak to me. But the main, that is, when I was thinking, because I started out interested in experience, that the meaning of life is part of life satisfaction, which I thought was secondary. And now several people, including Paul Dolan in the UK, who was my postdoc, have tried with some success, I think limited success, to say that people have experience of meaning in real time. And that's an interesting issue. My focus on this, and well, what happened to me first was that I thought that experience is really the definition of well-being, and that what people think about their lives doesn't, that's an epiphenomenon, secondary. It turned out that I couldn't be right, because what people want in their life, the decisions they make, have very little to do with how happy they're going to be. They're searching for life satisfaction. So to have a definition of well-being that doesn't correspond to what people want for themselves, that wasn't a big success. So I quit. I just gave up on that. So that's one. And the other criticism I have of the whole well-being movement is that it's really diametrically opposed in some sense to Seligman's point. I think there isn't enough focus on misery. That is all, and I think that as a social objective for society, the maximization of well-being is secondary, but minimizing suffering is an objective that we can all agree on. And as an objective for policy, instead of setting happiness as a measure of policy, setting the reduction of misery as an objective for policy would result in very different activities. And I think, ethically, it's the right thing to do. But so that's my response to the current research on well-being.
So, first of all, how do you define suffering? Let me just ask you that question. Like, how do you even operationalize such a thing?
Well, there are various ways. So the obvious way is experience sampling, where you periodically, you ping people on their phone today and you ask them to answer a few questions about how they feel right now and about what they are doing. We developed a technique that we call the day reconstruction method, which is that at the end of the day, you sort of recreate the story of your day in episodes, and you evaluate the emotional tone, and you describe the emotions associated with each episode. And then you can get an integral of the emotions. So you can talk about the average emotion over the day for an individual. So that's how you can operationalize it. Now, suffering is relatively easy to define, because you'd say of people that they suffer when they're in a state that they would want to escape. So that is operationally much easier to define than happiness. I mean, it's wanting this to end. Oh, I want to avoid this. I want to escape this. That's suffering for me, and it's well defined. And it turns out that, if you sample in the United States, so we did the same thing in France, when you look at a lot of people and take the average over time, 10, 15% of the overall time of the population is spent in a negative emotional state. Hmm. And that is very unevenly distributed in the population. A minority of people do most of the suffering. Mental illness is associated with it. Poverty, extreme poverty is associated with it. So there are categories of people who do most of the suffering. And most of the rest of us suffer relatively little. We vary in how happy we are. And, but that's genetically determined optimism. But it's easy to measure suffering.
Yeah, I appreciate that clarification. I have made the point to Marty, as people in his orbit call him, Martin Seligman, we call him Marty, because I worked with him closely for did you know that I ended up working with him for 5 years after we met in New York?
No, I didn't.
I ran something called the Imagination Institute with him. But anyway, I have made the point often that what one needs is not just learned hopefulness. They need real hope. Like, you can't just focus on psychological hope as the intervention and ignore the fact that people need to have, if you're languishing in poverty and there's not much cues of hope in your environment, we need to work on that too. So I definitely agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a very significant criticism, I think, of positive psychology, which is that in a deep sense, it's a very conservative approach. That is, you want to change the way that people feel about their lives, but that means you're not trying to change their lives. And that's the point that you were making right now, I think, that you want to change people's lives and not only they feel.
Yes. But I'm going to add a but here, because I think I'm going to try to argue as well there's still value to that research and to the field of positive psychology. Couldn't one make the case that that those who getting them above the zero line is that'll rise the tide for humanity? In a way, an analogous argument and debate is happening in the gifted education field in education. So you could, I think, perhaps extrapolate your argument to that field and say, well, we really should focus all of our resources on remediation, on helping the students who are most poor, and those who lack educational opportunities. But couldn't one argue that it's a false dichotomy, that we should be helping both, because we don't want those who are gifted students to fall between the cracks either, because they're ultimately going to rise the tide for all of humanity. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's a false dichotomy, and it's a false analogy.
Fair enough.
Because education is a resource that we're supplying, and the question is, who are we supplying it to? Now, happiness is not a resource that we're supplying. I mean, it's not that society is distributing happiness. So people are living their lives and objectively. And the question is how much and what resources and what focus we want to put on improving the way people feel about their lives, or in actually reducing suffering. Now, it's not that I'm against, some of my best friends are positive psychologists, so I'm not against positive psychology. One of my heroes is Richard Layard in the UK.
Oh, wow. That would make him feel really good to know. I'm going to tell him that you just called him one of your heroes.
Yeah. I mean, he knows that we're friends. He gives me credit for his career in well-being, because he became interested in well-being because of me, and I pointed him to, he actually came to Princeton to think about being with me, and we stayed friends ever since.
I love it. You're both legends.
Within 10 days of each other.
Your what's within? Say that again.
We were born within 10 days of each.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I know that you're not against the field of positive psychology. There's also, there's just a lot of nuances here that my brain's just going off in lots of different directions. So there's also an interesting distinction to be made, an important distinction to be made between the science of well-being and the application of the science of well-being. So certainly you have no issue with a good, rigorous science of well-being, right? Yeah.
And it is possible, and I think this is what Richard Layard is doing specifically in the UK. He has interventions to improve happiness, but I think measurement is in the background. It's going to be evidence-based, and his major contribution to well-being has been a massive effort to provide cognitive behavioral therapy in large government budgets. He's a member of the House of Lords, and he started that movement there and had a lot of influence on both Labour and Conservative, and increased together with Professor Clark from Oxford, the clinical psychologist. They have really changed the face of cognitive behavior therapy and greatly improved it. And all of that is very strictly evidence-based. And so you can do rigorous applied psychology of well-being.
I actually want to tell you about a paper that I wrote with my colleagues, Fallon Goodman. Actually, she was the lead author, Fallon Goodman, David Disbato, and Todd Cashton. What we wanted to do is we wanted to look, because I think a lot of this is a measurement issue, with a problem with self-report within the field. We wanted to see what's the correlation between subjective well-being measure, just simply how satisfied with your life, and the latent factor of all these other kinds of tests of facets of well-being that have been developed, like meaning and positive relationships and all this. We found a 0.998 correlation between, I'll send you the paper, a 0.98 correlation between the standard subjective well-being measure, a couple items, and a very, very the latent factor of a very comprehensive battery, a multidimensional of well-being. I think it's very, very hard in this field to rely on self-report, and because of a lot of issues you've pointed out in your own career of retrospective thinking. What you do when you take one of these questionnaires is you tend to think, if you're in a good mood or you tend to have a good positive evaluation of your life, you tend to, on average, say, oh yeah, everything's good. Positive relationships are good. Oh yeah, I got meaning too. Oh yeah, I got, and it's hard. It's really hard statistically to separate out a lot of things that we conceptually say are very clear distinctions, like meaning and positive emotions. But anyway, we think there's some real methodological issues here.
I mean, what you're going to do when you extract a single factor from many measures, you are going to extract a single factor. And that single factor could very well correspond to life satisfaction. But it's the same as in intelligence. You have many tests, you can extract a single factor, and there's still varieties of intelligence, numerical, spatial, vocabulary. So the fact that you can extract a single dominant factor and find a good measure for it really does not exclude the possibility, I think, that you could also find discriminations.
Well, I think, just to add a little further nuance to what we found. I mean, with structural modeling, as you know, you can look at different models, and what I think is interesting is that like the one factor model of all these disparate things was a better fit than parsing them out, in other various ways.
I haven't seen your paper. I would just say that there is a fair amount of research, I think, that indicates that different circumstances and different personality types are associated with different emotions. And so some people are angry and other people are depressed, and they're both negative states, but trying to pull them into one factor, you will not deny the difference between You will not deny the difference between joy and contentment, because there clearly is a difference between pleasure and contentment, and between anxiety and depression, or anxiety and anger. So there are varieties of feelings associated, and most of them are clearly positive or negative, but 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 they are multidimensional. So
For sure, for sure. I don't want to argue they're not multidimensional, but I think it's harder to get at it with these self-report questionnaires, I guess is the point,
I
where
mean,
you're doing a retrospective evaluation. Well, I think we need more of your kind of techniques of moment-to-moment sampling of these various things.
there is research indicating, Arthur Stone of the USC, with whom I collaborated 20 years ago on the study of well-being, he is a master in the study of experience sampling, and he was one of those who developed the day reconstruction method, which is retrospective. And he had good results indicating that actually you capture experience quite well if by retrospective judgments of experience at the end of the day.
Really?
And yeah, but there's a lot of evidence for that. So that if you focus people on their emotional experiences, they remember them. I mean, not perfectly, there are distortions, but on the average, they remember them. What is very different is when I ask you for a general evaluation of your life, you are going to do something entirely different. You are going to look at your life and compare it to other people's lives.
Yeah.
You're not going to analyze your emotional experiences.
That's really interesting. A lot of this research is asking you on thinking about your whole life, what is your meaning? What is your positive experiences? And it's really super interesting. The wealth and happiness link is another very, very interesting one. And you had published research showing that above about 75,000 per year income, it splits off. So you don't see much more return on your investment in terms of the experience, but you do still see an increase in life satisfaction. Is that the basic finding?
Yeah, I mean, that's Gallup has been studying well-being since the early 2000s. I was a consultant with them, and I was actually instrumental in their adding questions about affect and about emotion to their questionnaire, so that they have a measure that allows you, that they also have a general measure of life satisfaction, the ladder of life, so-called, which is essentially life satisfaction. So they have both. And we studied, and they have both. And Dino was a consultant with them. I was a consultant with them. That's how it began. And in the Gallup data, it's absolutely clear that when you look at experience, then in the United States, above about $75,000, it really flattens. I mean, Angus Deaton, the famous economist Angus Deaton, and I did that study where we found absolutely no increase in emotional satisfaction beyond $75,000. I think there have been data that find a slight increase, but it's clear that there is some inflection, and that the curve for life satisfaction is different and steeper, and that life satisfaction continues increasing beyond that. Now, there has been a study recently by Killingsworth, which shows, using different techniques and so on, which seems to shows that emotions keep improving with income. So we have two discrepant results. There's no question that our result is solid and replicable, and there is no real explanation so far of the discrepancy. That is, what happened is that Killingsworth is more recent. I mean, this is something that happens all the time in psychology and in the social sciences. The more recent paper is assumed to do justice to everything that happened before it. So Uh, and Killingsworth's interpretation of why his results are different from ours is, of course, it blames our research and said that our research was inadequate. But in fact, it's perfectly clear that I think his explanation of the discrepancy doesn't hold water, and I have no idea what the true explanation is. So we'll have to look at it more closely. But
I'm
it's
really
not.
curious. Yeah, I want to see how that gets
So am I.
resolved.
So am I. I mean, I'm sure there is an answer, and I'm pretty sure we'll find it, but we don't know it yet.
Yeah, I feel like regardless of whatever the veracity of that turns out to be, there still is a deeper truth, which is how one spends one's money and one's time is going to be a better predictor of one's happiness than the specific money that you have above a certain point. Isn't that fair to say?
That is certainly fair to say, that how you spend your time. So that is a direct implication of thinking about emotion, is that whether you spend your time commuting or with your children makes a big difference your emotional happiness over a day. I mean, you have 2 days that you could, 2 hours each day that you could spend this way or that way. It makes a big difference. So that's undoubtedly the case.
Yeah. I would love to talk about your new book, Noise.
Okay.
What in the world is the difference between bias and noise, and why is noise rarely recognized in conversations about human error?
Well, when you think of measurements, using a ruler to measure a line, if you make multiple measurements, they will not be accurate, and they will vary. They will not be the same from time to time. The average error is the bias, and the variability is noise. And so clearly, they're both sources of inaccuracy, because if bias is 0, but measurements are all over the place, they're just, on average, they're correct, they're still not accurate. Now, there is a way of measuring error, of measuring accuracy, which is accepted in all the sciences. Actually, it's been around for since the beginning of the 19th century. It's associated with Frederick Gauss, and there is that measure, particular measure. In that measure, the total measure of error is the square of the bias and the square of the noise, where noise is measured by the standard deviation. So in a theory of error, which is the accepted theory, bias and noise have equivalent roles: the average error and the standard deviation of error. This is something that people really don't think about. Now, it's natural for people to think of bias, because bias is an error. I mean, it represents something. You can imagine what it is. Variability is much harder to represent, and much harder to think about, and much harder to realize the role of variability in inaccuracy, in error. So that's bias and noise. Now, where do you find noise? Because it's a very abstract thing. If you look at judges looking at the same case, their sentences will actually be all over the place. And the standard deviation in one of the studies, with the average sentence was 7 years, the standard deviation was 3.8. That means that a defendant faces a lottery, depending on which judge will be assigned to him or her, that is unacceptable. There is noise in medicine. There is noise in the evaluation of assets. There is noise in the assignment of children to foster care. There is noise in patents. So there is noise everywhere. So those are differences that should not exist. That's variability that should not exist in those systems. In addition, there is variability within the individual. That is, the same judge will not give the same sentence. depending on temperature. Sentences are harsher on hot days. People assign heavier sentences the day after their football team loses. So that's noise within a judge. Anyway, that's noise. And that's what my recent book is about, written with two collaborators.
It's fascinating, and I'm trying to wrap my head around this with like IQ testing, and you want the signal is the true IQ score, and you never ever know the true IQ score. You only have like you have a range of and you have how you've confidence intervals. How can you and there are lots of domains you talk about in there, but I am really curious in double clicking on in personnel selection and kind of the use of these standardized tests as well for college selection. Do you see a lot of noise in college admissions?
Oh, there's a lot of noise in college admissions.
Yeah.
There's a lot of noise in hiring. I mean, that's well known. There's a lot of noise in personnel evaluation. I mean, the conclusion in studies of the evaluations that employees get is that the ratings they get, the ratings are more predictable. You can predict ratings better if you know who did the rating than if you know who the ratee is. So
that's problematic.
Noise is generally problematic and frequently completely ignored. It's assumed away.
You're right.
So,
not that you need me to say you're right, but you're right. You're right.
Well,
this is important. This is important. Yeah.
I need people to say I'm right on this one.
No, it's so important. Let's talk about how this relates to the proliferation of diversity and inclusion initiatives in hiring practices, because they're focused on reducing bias, right? But how could they benefit perhaps from also considering noise? Have you thought about that?
It turns out that the major source of error in many decisions is actually noise and not bias. So, for example, you have bail judges who decide whether to keep somebody incarcerated or release them before trial. And clearly you want to minimize crime, and clearly you want to minimize unnecessary incarceration of people. But it turns out when you look at it carefully, there are huge differences between judges in who they release and who they don't. So there have been large-scale studies with hundreds of thousands of decisions by thousands of judges, which make it very clear that a defendant facing a bail decision is facing a lottery, as that depends a lot on who the judge is, and because different judges have different tastes about who should get bail. From the point of view of an organization, suppose you have an organization that is doing hiring. Now, if there is a bias, then of course there will be errors. But suppose there is no overall bias. So suppose you have an organization that is where half of the people who make hiring decisions are biased in favor of women and half are biased against them. So overall, there is no bias. But clearly, something is wrong with that organization, and what's wrong is noise. So there is real bias at the individual level and sometimes at the organizational level, and bias at the individual level when there are differences between individuals creates noise.
I see.
And there is a lot of that.
Yeah, so a different way of framing it. I really like this. Well, bias is obviously, we're both agreed, very, very important to address and to become aware of. But in some ways, bias can be almost easier to see and as a problem than noise can
Much
be.
easier.
Yeah. I think that's what we were saying.
And that's the point about.
Yeah, I get it. I love it. I'm so glad that you pointed a finger at it. So you talk about ways of trying to make this ways of reducing noise. You talk about decision hygiene. What are some examples of decision hygiene?
Well, first of all, the concept of hygiene and what it's And the idea was to distinguish hygiene from medication or vaccination. That is, when you're medicating or vaccinating or doing surgery, you're dealing with a specific illness and you're trying to combat a specific illness. When you wash your hands, you don't know which germs you're protecting yourself from. That's hygiene. So, and if you're successful, you will never know because you won't get the disease. So there is a whole category of steps and procedures that you are more likely to think about when you think about hygiene, when you think about then about noise really and reducing noise, then you think when you're trying to minimize bias. So, and an example of hygiene is the one we started with when I was describing my work in the Israeli army. That is, when you have a decision problem, instead of trying to develop an intuition about the problem as a whole, breaking up the problem into segments, evaluating each segment in a fact-based way, and then having a global evaluation, which can be intuitive, that is hygiene. That's an improvement. That will reduce noise, reduce bias, and improve decisions. And there are other steps that belong to decision hygiene, like making judgments comparative. So we're not very good at making absolute judgments, how good something is, or how much money something is worth. We're much better at making comparative judgment, that this candidate is better than that candidate, or this object is worth more than that object. So you get much less noise and much higher accuracy in relative judgment than in absolute judgment. So trying to switch people to make comparative judgments and providing them with comparative scale that are easy to use, that's a step in decision hygiene. And we have a few more.
And all of this falls under the umbrella of, a noise audit. I like this idea of a noise audit, that you go to a workplace and maybe we'll have noise audit consultants or something someday. That could be a new field where you go in and armed with all this. Yeah, all these principles. I found the quote that I really liked to illustrate the point we were just talking about before. You said, bias has a kind of explanatory charisma which noise lacks. I love that quote. I love it. Yeah, because it's so true. A lot of people are talking about bias right now, but I don't see noise as much on the radar.
That's right. And the omission is so obvious that we wanted to do something about it. That's what the book is for.
Wonderful. How have you just couple general questions about your life. How do you think you've grown over the course of your life? I saw an interview you did with Sam Harris. He asked you if studying biases your whole life has made you less biased, and you said no, not really. You said not really, but there are other dimensions to oneself than their cognitive biases. As a whole person, how do you think you've grown in your life?
Well, when you change, you develop some wisdom, and the wisdom is that the number of things that you get very excited about diminishes, and that you look at things from a greater distance and with somewhat more objectivity. And those things happen with age. I mean, it's just if you live long enough and you don't lose your marbles completely, this will happen to you. This is, it's growth in a certain sense, but it's because when you grow old, you also become detached and you're less part of the action and you're less involved and you're less relevant. And all that enables you to be wise and detached. So it's not all growth, as a very good thing. It's also that you are moving from the center of the action, and this is inevitable.
And with the cognitive biases in particular, are there any that you feel like you've really moved the dial on throughout the course of your career?
Of those, Yeah, I mean, there are a few cognitive biases that you can sometimes be aware of. That, oh, I'm being anchored. You know, somebody is giving me that number, and that number is affecting my thinking. But by and large, it's very difficult when you are just making a mistake to become aware that you're making a mistake. That really doesn't come naturally. Certainly doesn't come naturally to me.
It's an amazing testament to your humility to win the Nobel Prize over this, and to admit that you still have some of these biases yourself. And it inspires me in a way, and it also makes me feel hopeless as well.
Yeah, I think the latter is appropriate.
I have a question just about winning the Nobel Prize. In what way did winning the Nobel Prize increase your happiness in life?
Oh, in multiple ways. I mean, but I would tell you something that people don't realize. I mean, the experience of winning that prize, I mean, the thing that's most salient about that experience is how much pleasure it gives to other people. So anybody who likes you, no, they don't have to like you. Anybody who is connected to you feels some pleasure. And, this is totally unjustified. I mean, there is no logic behind it, doesn't matter. But the fact is that this is an association, and people in many other domains, many other successes that you have, other people are going to begrudge you, or there's going to be some envy. For some reason, the Nobel Prize is not one of them, at least maybe among your colleagues, but certainly not among people. So that was a major thing during the first year when I was really conscious of it, was how much pleasure this was giving to everybody around me. So that in itself is a sort of great happiness, is that you feel you're sort of, that people are happy. You're making people happy by something that is happening to you. So that was
your mother will tell everyone about it.
Yeah. But
Danny, my son Danny got the Nobel Prize.
She wasn't around, and but neighbors would say. I mean, and so that's part of it. It's really quite. I hadn't anticipated this, but it's long faded. But the initial experience, that was very salient, and in general, it certainly improves life. I recommend it to everybody. It's not your credibility increases. People, and you get more access to resources, but you're taken more seriously than you deserve to be taken. A lot of good things happen, and there isn't much downside if you don't let it sort of dominate your life. If you let it dominate your life, it's not good, but you don't.
Well, not only dominate your life. I mean, to what extent overconfidence could also be a problem. To what extent did it increase your confidence? Were you ever insecure before winning the Nobel Prize? Did it make you feel more confident? Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think I once heard somebody describe the experience of being knighted, and he had a phrase that really impressed me. He said, "You don't sweat the small stuff." That something happens that gives you a different perspective. So it really is a matter of luck. But when that thing happens to you, it really changes your life for the better. Feels quite unfair.
I feel like everyone should be able to win the Nobel Prize at some point in their life to increase their well-being and so what advice? Okay, well, this is the question I want to ask. If you were just starting out in the field right now, today, you're fresh out of grad school, what topic or area would you be most excited to spend your career studying?
Oh, I think today I would go either into brain science or into artificial intelligence.
Hmm.
That's where I would go, because at the moment, that's where a lot of exciting things seem to be happening.
Totally. And there's a whole fascinating literature on bias in algorithms. And
Yeah,
that's a whole other topic. But you know what I mean? That's, whew,
yeah.
if you could apply your work to that area. What do you see as the next era of behavioral economics and behavioral science?
I have I have a rule against forecasting. I just don't believe people can do it. And I can say trivial things about what is happening now, and which is likely to remain so for the next 4 or 5 years. But I nobody can predict what will happen, and those who tell you they can are just deluding themselves.
Hey, that's an answer in itself. So fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. And I'm sure you get asked this one all the time, but what do you think, or what do you want your greatest legacy to be?
I I think I don't. Uh, you know, I don't spend much time thinking about it. I'm pleased right now that I think, in, right now I think that I would like the idea of noise to catch on. Uh, I would have liked adversarial collaboration to catch. I think that the way that we conduct controversies is ridiculous, and something should be done to, what we were talking about with that study of well-being, where somebody is getting different results. This is really not a way to conduct science.
Hmm.
I mean, to have somebody and then no contact, you just, and that happens all the time. Instead of people saying, "Oh, look, I mean, I have a result that doesn't seem to fit yours. Let's compare notes. Let's see. Let's talk." What you get is very adversarial, and I had that idea of adversarial collaboration, and I don't think it's going to. It hasn't had much impact, but I wish it had.
Oh, I love that. I wish I saw that more in Congress, for instance. You know,
Uh,
that's a different story, I know, but
yeah.
I wish we just saw that in various different aspects of one's life. So do you have grandchildren?
Yes.
What advice do you give them about living in this world moving forward, in the kind of world we're living in today and next 100 years? What do you have, like, any general sort of wisdom?
No, of course not. I mean, I wouldn't dare give advice to my grandchildren. I mean, uh, I, I can give them advice about how to navigate the
Well,
university and graduate school,
if that's too broad a question, I could narrow it and say, what about to aspiring psychologists? What advice do you have to young psychologists who are going to the field? Just general advice for them.
well, I mean, when I think that not getting too attached to your ideas is really an important piece of advice, that you have a lot of people getting attached to mediocre ideas instead of looking for better ones. That I think. And being willing to move if things don't work, and just not getting stuck. That would be my advice. But also consider whether this is the life for you. That is, academic life has, it has its advantages, its benefits, and its costs, and it's much more suitable for some personalities than for others. And it would be good advice for some people: just don't do this, because you're not going to be happy, and you're not going to be as productive as you could be. So that I think. I think I wrote that in Thinking Fast and Slow, but it's that in order to be a scientist, successful scientist, you have to be able to exaggerate the importance of what you're doing. If you cannot exaggerate the importance of what you're involved in, you will feel futile. And you can see that. And in order to be passionate about what you're doing, you have to think that this is the most interesting thing in the whole universe, or at least, I mean, I'm exaggerating now, but you have to view it as bigger than it really is. And not everybody has that characteristic. And some people have it too much. But that's not important.
That's a different story.
Yeah.
Is there a study that you wish you had done and didn't do? You're like, wow, I wish I did this study.
Well, I mean, I constantly have that when I read experiments by other people, when I'm very impressed. I say, I wish I'd done that.
But I guess I'm more a study that hasn't been done yet, but you're like, if I had the resources, yeah.
Oh, there must have been, I don't remember them. Maybe okay. It's not something that I have stored, that I had that regret about a study I should have done and didn't. No.
So this is my last question. The evaluation of one's life and their satisfaction. Can you just give me think about your life and give me just a retrospective reflection on overall, have you been happy, satisfied, content, etc.?
Well, I mean, I view myself as having been extraordinarily lucky. So I was lucky. I didn't, we spoke about the war that I had in Europe and so on, but I was lucky. I mean, I survived, and I didn't really suffer hunger or torture. So I was lucky then, and I've been lucky all my life. I've been mainly lucky in the friends I've had and in the collaborations I've had. So that's made my life. All my work has been social, and I've enjoyed every part of it. So that's my main evaluation. I've been very fortunate.
Thank you so much, Danny, for this wonderful chat today and for being so inspiring to so many of us in the field of psychology as well as the broader public, and your humility, your graciousness, your intellect, and your humanity. Thank you so much for being on the Psychology Podcast today.
Thank you, Scott. You embarrassed me, but I forgive you. See you. Bye-bye.
Don't stop there. Where did I embarrass you? At what point?
By all this praise.
Oh, I gotcha. Well, I hear you. I really do mean it from the bottom of my heart. So thanks again. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in on the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com. That's thepsychologypodcast.com. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.